Welcome back from Thanksgiving break, everyone. Hope you enjoyed your much needed and much deserved rest, and I hope you enjoyed your FDA approved turkey. It may be difficult to think back through the fog of your food coma about what we talked about last, but in case you've forgotten, we are in our chapter on the bureaucracy. We last talked about the basic structure of the bureaucracy, kind of how it works in general, and the fact that there are bureaucratic policies literally everywhere. You can't escape it. But just how are those bureaucratic regulations really made, and are there any checks and balances that we have on the bureaucracy, or is it turning into an uncontrollable monster? We'll finally get to the age-old question of whether or not the bureaucracy is actually efficient or not. Cue the intro. Thanks to copyright laws, that's the public domain music I've now stuck with in my intros. Thanks, Copyright Office. So Section 3 of your textbook begins to take a closer look at how the bureaucracy makes and implements regulations. As it points out, though the bureaucracy is a key implementer of policy, getting to the policy they actually want to implement is complex and it is always changing. They first have to define the problem, but before they even do that, they have to get on the policy agenda. Then they have to get the policy debated and passed within the bureaucracy. And then there's the all-important discussion of finance. How are you going to pay for the things you need to implement the policy? So a long series of events take place far before bureaucrats can actually do their job effectively. Bureaucracies are in a constant cycle of first defining a problem, getting that problem on the agenda, forming and adopting some sort of a policy to address that problem, then budgeting for the implementation of that problem. Then once they have the money, then they can actually go out and implement it. But after you implement a policy, you need to evaluate it. If there are more problems, then you need to start the cycle over again by defining the problems and addressing them. Or if it's so bad, you may just want to terminate the entire thing and get rid of the policy. As I hinted at last week, the bureaucracy's role is to implement the policy that Congress has created, and that's why the bureaucracy is part of the executive branch. But I also mentioned last week that the bureaucracy actually has some rule-making power. They actually get to create some regulations themselves. So how does that work? Well, remember what Craig said in one of the crash course videos I assigned. Members of Congress are policy generalists. Members of the bureaucracy are policy specialists. They're experts in a particular field. That's why Congress, whose membership is mostly lawyers, will write policies that are a little bit vague to provide for something called bureaucratic discretion. Bureaucratic discretion is where bureaucrats have some power to decide how a law is implemented. And again, the idea is that the bureaucrats are policy specialists, so they're going to have a better idea on how to specifically implement a particular law. So it gives them a little bit of flexibility to play around with things as they may see fit since they're the experts. And that's what the word discretion means. It basically means that you have a choice to make. So after the bureaucrats have their bureaucratic discretion, they will then begin actually creating regulations. And regulations is the process through which the federal bureaucracy fills in the critical details of a law. So this is where they fill in the gaps of any vagueness that Congress may have given them in the law. This is where they get a little more specific. All right, so let's take a look at a real life example of this. In fact, we'll use that box of tissues that I showed you last time. You'll notice on the back of this box of tissues, it said it violates federal law to use this tissue for any other reason except for blowing your nose. And then at the bottom, it had a specific EPA regulation number. So that right there already reveals to us that Congress passed a federal law. There was some sort of a bureaucratic discretion in between about how that law should be implemented, and then there was a specific bureaucratic regulation that was created by the EPA. So what's the specific weird story behind this law that led to this really bizarre regulation? Well, I did some legislative sleuthing, and here's what I found. Now, you'll notice on the back of this box of tissues that it actually has some active ingredients which are designed to kill the bacteria in the tissue once you sneeze into it. One of those active ingredients is citric acid, and citric acid is a common ingredient in pesticides.
For those of you who may not know, pesticides refer to a substance that's used to kill harmful insects that may be harmful to other plants or organisms.
Now, if enough of an active ingredient in a pesticide is ingested, it can cause toxic poisoning in a human. Also, some of the active ingredients in pesticide can also be combined with other things to make something blow up. So it is therefore possible that someone could extract some of the chemicals out of the tissue and use them to create a poison or blow something up or do something else dangerous with it. And obviously they'd have to extract the chemicals out of a lot of those tissues. So in an attempt to prevent people from misusing pesticides, Congress passed the Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act in 1996, FIFRA. In this act, anyone that sells anything with active pesticide ingredients has to register with the EPA to get a license in order to sell those things. And the law, of course, makes it illegal to use pesticides in any way except for their intended use. And it gives the EPA bureaucratic discretion to create regulations that enforce that law and the intention of that law. So what is EPA Regulation 9402-10? Okay, it turns out there's actually a lot to that regulation, but to summarize it simply for you, when Kleenex goes to apply for a license in order to sell their tissues that have active ingredients of pesticides in them, when they go apply for that license, the EPA requires them to place certain labels on the bottom of the box of tissues. Amongst those labels are not only the active ingredient, they also must list the warning that if the tissue is used for anything besides its intended purpose, that it violates federal law. And you can see that actually here on the EPA documents. It specifically cites the provision of that law passed by Congress that makes it illegal. And then they also require them to put the EPA regulation on the bottom of the box as well. So that's kind of an example of the process. Congress passed a law trying to prevent the misuse of pesticides and things that have the chemicals that make up pesticides in. And they delegated some discretion to the EPA to decide exactly how that law should specifically be implemented. Then the EPA used their bureaucratic discretion to create regulations that would force companies that are selling products with active pesticide ingredients in them to apply for a license with the EPA. Part of that licensing process requires the companies then to put labeling on their products before they sell them that provide the warning that Congress wanted in the legislation they passed. Don't you feel safe and protected? Thanks, EPA, for saving me from myself. Now, take a second and think about it from Kleenex's perspective. Here they have a product they want to sell, but they have to go through a licensing process. They have to get labeling approved. All of that takes time, and it also takes money to do those things as well. All of those hoops and regulations companies have to jump through just to maybe get a product approved to be sold is often referred to as red tape. A lot of companies aren't big fans of red tape because that's time and money spent complying to regulations that could be reallocated back into their business to create more products or maybe make products even cheaper, or to maybe increase the quality of goods in their own company. Maybe that money can be used to increase the salaries of their employees or to hire even more employees to help their company produce things. Now, bigger, wealthier companies often like red tape because they can absorb the cost of complying to the regulations, but their smaller competitors may not be able to. So sometimes they enter the iron triangle we discussed last time and advocate for the bureaucracy to implement more regulations and put in more red tape that gives them a competitive advantage in the marketplace. As has been the theme of this whole chapter on the bureaucracy, there are regulations everywhere, and there's over 100 different regulatory agencies in the federal government, including one of the most notorious, hopefully you know by now, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. So, oh crap, I really did spill water on myself this time. Dang it! Anyway, while there might be hundreds of regulatory agencies, there's different types of bureaucracies. You obviously have the big ones, the most notable ones, like the cabinet departments, Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury, Defense Department, Homeland Security. Under the cabinet departments, you have other various offices as well. Then there's independent executive agencies or independent regulatory agencies. And these agencies, like cabinet departments, are directly accountable to the president. And the president appoints the head of these various departments. But unlike cabinet departments, these are far more specific agencies. They're considered independent because they don't really have another agency or department over top of them. They're not really subject to anyone's regulation outside of Congress and the president. So some famous examples of independent executive agencies would be the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, NASA, the EPA, as well as other agencies, the ICC, which is the Interstate Commerce Commission, as well as the SEC, No, not the football conference, the Securities Exchange Commission. They help regulate the stock market. Then there's government corporations, which are government-controlled and owned businesses like the post office and Amtrak. They're designed to provide a good or service to the citizens of the United States. And just like with the others, the president picks some of the top leaders to run those corporations, and they're confirmed by the Senate. While Amtrak and the post office do try to generate revenue through the services that they offer, like, for example, selling stamps, they do get a lot of funding from Congress, in part because both Amtrak and the post office have been known to run big-time losses. It's kind of understandable why they would run losses. I mean, there's really no incentive to provide great service and make money when you're controlled by an institution that can bail you out at any moment with funds that they obtain through compulsory taxation. Having unlimited access to free money you didn't have to earn no matter what you end up doing turns out to be such a great business model that people will vigorously defend it. Anytime the post office gets attacked for running losses, people defend it and say, if we didn't have the post office, how would we get our mail delivered? And, you know, to be honest, I don't know how a private company could efficiently deliver things. I've never seen it done before. So it's really a great point. Checkmate, they got me there. All right, if you know someone that works in the post office or is a postal worker, it's nothing against them, but there's been some serious mismanagement in the upper levels of the bureaucracy when it comes to things like the post office and Amtrak. Oftentimes, whenever there's disputes between parties, bureaucrats resort to something called bureaucratic adjudication. And that's when the federal bureaucracy settles disputes between parties that arise over the implementation of federal laws or determines which groups or individuals are covered under a regulation or program. For example, this past year, President Trump nominated a new postmaster general, the person that heads the post office, and there was a crisis that precipitated from some of the changes he made. This resulted in major delays in mail being delivered and even warranted its own Wikipedia page about the crisis called the 2020 U.S. Postal Service crisis. So since there was some disputes going on in the bureaucracy, there was definitely some bureaucratic adjudication that went on this summer. Rightly so, because there was a presidential election coming up where an unprecedented amount of people were probably going to vote by mail. In defense of the post office, some people argue that they should be the ones delivering mail, especially when it comes to things like elections and stuff, because if a private company does, who knows? Maybe they might accidentally lose some ballots from the candidate that they don't want to win. Now, that might make you think, wait a second, Mr. Lucas, are bureaucrats allowed to also be political and engage in politics and like donate to campaigns and stuff? Well, they're heavily restricted from engaging in political campaigns. The Hatch Act, which was passed and signed into law, orders that bureaucrats can't raise money for campaigns. They're prohibited from participating in federal campaigns or holding elected office. It was meant to separate the official authority of the bureaucracy from partisan politics. So let's say bureaucracy, whether it's the post office or someone else, has implemented a policy that's not so good. What checks are there on the bureaucracy? Well, let's start with presidential checks on the bureaucracy. Remember, the president has formal control over the executive branch, being the chief executive. So the president can appoint and remove individuals at the top layers of the bureaucracy. As I've told you before, President Trump has actually removed and fired a lot of upper-level bureaucrats. But when the president goes to appoint someone, they try to pick someone based on their political ideology and their willingness to carry out the administration's goals in that bureaucratic department. The president also helps write the annual budget, and the president can decide to take money away from a certain bureaucracy and maybe pad the budget of another bureaucracy. Now, while the president can control the upper-level bureaucrats, it's much harder for them to control the lower-level bureaucrats who may be lifetime employees and have a career out of being a lower-level bureaucrat. Don't worry, the legislative branch gets their say too. There's plenty of congressional checks on the bureaucracy as well. For example, of course, the Senate confirms the president's appointees to the cabinets and bureaucratic positions. Legislation can terminate or create new agencies and programs where they can set up goals, priorities, and even design the structure of the organization itself. Congress can also provide oversight, and that's where they have congressional hearings where members of the bureaucracy may be required to testify before Congress to justify their actions. I'll show you a couple examples of congressional oversight in action. The first clip I'm going to show you is of Congressman Ron Paul going after the Federal Reserve Chair, Ben Bernanke. These two notoriously didn't like each other.
But my question is, Mr. Chairman, whose responsibility is it under the Constitution to manage monetary policy? Which branch of government has the absolute authority to manage monetary policy?
The Congress has the authority, and it's delegated to the Federal Reserve. That's a policy decision that you made.
Yeah, but they can't transfer authority You can't amend the Constitution by just saying we're going to create some secret group of individuals and banks. That's amending the Constitution. You can't do that and all of a sudden allow this to exist in secrecy. And whose responsibility is it for oversight? Which branch of government has the right of oversight?
Congress has the right of oversight, and we certainly fully accept that, and we fully accept the need for transparency and accountability. But it is a well-established fact that an independent central bank will provide better outcomes. If you want to go, there's no constitutional reason why Congress couldn't just take over monetary policy. If you want to do that, I guess that's your right to do it, but I'm advising you that it wouldn't be very good from an economic policy point of view.
Gosh, that exchange sounded a lot like the debate over whether or not a national bank was constitutional or not in the case McCulloch versus Maryland. This next oversight example took place about 8 or 9 months ago and shows Representative Clark of the Education Committee in the House of Representatives questioning Betsy DeVos, the Secretary of Education, and things got a little tense.
Will you guarantee to me, to the children of this country, that however funded this program that is in your budget, that is $5 billion of taxpayer money, when it is rolled out in states, will you guarantee that every single school will have a non-discrimination policy in order to qualify for that?
Well, Congresswoman, this is not proposed to be a federal program. This is proposed to be a federal tax credit that doesn't.
Will you guarantee?
Let me finish. The legislation is specifically for states to create programs that are going to meet the needs of the most vulnerable and needy students in their state.
So we're right back to where we were.
We are right back to the reality of the fact that this program is to be implemented and designed at the state level, voluntarily contributed to by federal taxpayers.
So I'm going to be clear that you have corrected the record when you said to me that you, as Secretary of Education, would ensure that this program would only go to schools with non-discrimination policies. That is no longer your stance. This is a state's choice that you will not do that as Secretary of Education.
Ma'am, may I just suggest that you're mixing up and you're not staying clear on the purpose of this program, which is to help students get a great education
your
in a place that fits for them.
To say that you would stand up for kids is appalling, and you really should resign.
Okay, looked like a battle over federalism there. The fact that these congressional hearings nowadays are televised live means that if a politician can get a Secretary of Education or any of the members of the bureaucracy to slip up during a hearing, then they can use that to mobilize the public support potentially against that particular department in the bureaucracy. On top of the power of congressional oversight, there also exists the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, and they monitor if funds are being spent appropriately by the bureaucracy. So they serve as a safeguard against future mistakes, and they try to hold bureaucrats accountable for their actions. As you can probably guess by now too, the judicial branch also can check the bureaucracy as well. A more recent example occurred in 2015 in the Supreme Court case Michigan versus the EPA. In that case, the Supreme Court overturned the EPA's limits on mercury, arsenic, and acidic gases emitted by coal-fired power plants, also known as MATs. This was challenged by private sector businesses because compliance was really expensive. They estimated the cost to be near $9.6 billion, but it was to prevent premature deaths. Justice Antonin Scalia, a strict constructionist and a very famous originalist, determined the EPA's interpretation of the Clean Air Act was, quote, unreasonable. So, to summarize all that, the bureaucracy can be checked by the executive branch for the fact that the president can appoint people to the upper-level bureaucracies or fire them and kick them out of office. The legislative branch can check the bureaucracy through the budgeting process and through congressional oversight and hearings. And the judicial branch, of course, has the power of judicial review to strike down regulations that the bureaucracy might make. So while people can check the power of the informal fourth branch of government through the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, public opinion rarely constricts the behavior of the bureaucracy. But occasionally there are times when a bureaucracy's ineptitude to actually handle a situation well can cause the public to become very wary of them. For example, after Hurricane Hurricane Katrina in 2005, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, also known as FEMA, was a complete and utter disaster at actually getting relief to the people that needed it quickly and efficiently. Because FEMA did such a horrible job, a lot of private organizations stepped up and delivered relief far more efficiently and quickly than FEMA did. Besides faith-based organizations, companies like Walmart stepped up and they delivered a ton of water bottles, food, and clothing to those who needed it. After that debacle, people began to see that private organizations and private charities, meaning not government, could actually step up and provide for people, perhaps even better than the government. Obviously, private businesses have an incentive to help out in times of disaster because it earns them a good reputation. Then they can run commercials and market the fact that they've helped and make you feel better about spending money at their business. So it makes you feel like the money you're giving them is also going to help the people in need. Bureaucracies, on the other hand, are more insulated from competition. If a bureaucracy does a really bad job, they're still going to be funded by the government in the congressional and presidential budgets. Instead of losing money due to a failure, they'll actually probably get more money and say that the reason they couldn't do their job well was because of a lack of funding. So not only do bureaucracies have fewer incentives to do a good job than compared to private organizations who are subject to competition in the market, attempts to hold the bureaucracy accountable through the political process can prove to be very slow and time-consuming and inefficient. So since Hurricane Katrina in 2005, Americans have been more open to the idea of privatizing certain aspects of the bureaucracy. It means taking that institution's responsibilities out of the hand of government and giving it over to maybe a private business or a private organization. Since then, Americans have had a less positive view of the bureaucracy, and they're very weary of too much power getting into the hands of those who are unelected. So over time, the bureaucracy has morphed into kind of an informal fourth branch of government. As government has expanded in its size, its scope, and its responsibilities, it's good that the executive branch has more institutions to help delegate tasks to implement and enforce all of these new policies. And while Congress is full of policy generalists, it's good that the bureaucracy is full of policy experts who actually know more about the policy arena they're in charge of. The limited amount of political pressure on the bureaucrats means that they can be more insulated from the world of politics and they can focus on doing their job and creating efficient regulations. On the flip side, though, the fact that bureaucrats are unelected means that it's hard for the public to keep them accountable. That, coupled with the fact that Congress has delegated some rulemaking power to the bureaucracy, kind of tramples on the whole idea of separation of power. I mean, there is a reason the founding fathers tried to separate the legislative and executive branches. You wouldn't want a police officer making rules up on the spot and then enforcing them. That's a lot of centralization of power, and that can be dangerous. All right, so here's your assignments for this week. Obviously, you've got this Ed puzzle, which is almost done. By Thursday of this week, I want you to answer some of the questions I put in a video that I uploaded to Perusal. In this video, John Stossel questions the role of the federal government in providing disaster relief and looks at the role of private organizations in supplanting government in that role. Now, I will qualify this video by saying that John Stossel has a very strong libertarian bias, but question him, challenge him on some of the points that he made. And lastly, this week, of course, finish outlining the rest of Chapter 7. That'll be due on Friday. Also, make sure you take a look at the feedback I gave you on your last practice FRQ. In your textbook, you'll notice that this is the end of the next unit. So we're actually going to stop here and then begin to review everything we've covered from the beginning of the year up to the end of this chapter. So this video is actually the last new bit of content I'm giving you until you come back from winter break. So next week, I'll go over in more detail exactly how we're going to review and what your midterm assessment's going to look like. Until then, have a great week.